Joining us for a look at yesterday's election results and the campaigning along the way is the senior editor of the Bay State Banner, Yawu Miller. Thank you very much for being with us, Yawu.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you. I had the feeling that there was something about yesterday's or maybe this morning's results that were not exactly what I would have expected a few months ago. How did you feel?
I think having looked at polling and talked to people going into it, I tried not to have any expectations. Just that we had no way of knowing what was going to happen. I mean, we collaborated with Poll Progressive on a poll that showed Asabi George coming in second, and there was another more recent poll. And I think what really may have clinched it for her was that that it was a low turnout preliminary. I don't know exactly what the figures are, but everybody within the days before the election, people were predicting low turnout, which tends to favor white working class voters in Dorchester, South Boston, and that's really the core of Asabi George's base, where she got some of her biggest returns were in Neponset, Savin Hill, those neighborhoods that have traditionally, it was Marty Walsh's base. She grew up on the same street as Walsh and drew from the same, from the same base of power.
I did get as far as figuring out that there were fewer people voting in this preliminary than there were in the preliminary election for 2013. Some viewers might be saying, well, why didn't we have a repeat of what happened in 2018 when in the same primary that year, Ayanna Pressley was a winner, and then we had Rachel Rollins, Nika Lugardo, John Santiago, all these new faces that were getting elected. Why is this more like the old kind of Boston election?
I think that the level of enthusiasm around Lugardo, Pressley, and Rollins was higher than for this crop of mayoral candidates. That the progressive vote was split, and I think a lot of people felt conflicted. The African American vote was split, and there was negative campaigning, which can, I think, actually suppress turnout when you hear negative things about a candidate, that maybe you were favoring. I think it was a very different race than in 2018.
Now, of course, there was an effort to unify the Black vote. This is not the first time that has happened, but I'm also wondering whether these third-party unification efforts really matter that much. I mean, maybe Rachel Rollins, Ayanna Pressley, they won because they were good candidates. Did it really make much difference this year?
Yeah, I do think that Rollins just ran a stellar campaign, and she won on the strength of her own efforts, not because any group of people tried to convince people that they shouldn't vote for other people. It was really her. I think in this instance, clearly, efforts to unify the Black vote around one candidate did not work. Campbell came in with her own. She came in the race a lot earlier in September of last year, whereas Janey came in April of this year. And each one brought their own base. They brought their own things to the race. With regard to Black voters, there is no one single Black community. We live in a community that where there are Cape Verdeans, there are people from the Caribbean, from Haiti, from Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago. It's not like one single Black community where some person can magically get everybody on the same page, any more than you could do that with Boston voters writ large.
You could look at the votes for Andrea Campbell and Kim Janey as a split, but if you lump them together, you get almost 40% of the active electorate. What do you think that's going to mean in November?
I do think that the Black vote is going to be pivotal. I think Asabi George, the fact that both Asabi George and Wu got only 9% of the Black vote in one of the most recent polls demonstrates that both camps are going to have to make a concerted effort to reach out to Black voters to talk about the issues that Black voters are concerned with. No mayoral candidate since Menino in '93 has won without Black, Latino, and progressive white voters. You need that coalition to prevail. You can't do it. I mean, Marty Walsh could not have beat John Connolly in 2013 without that coalition. It really has its roots back to the 1983 mayoral race when Mel King coined the term the Rainbow Coalition. You need Black, Latino, Asian, and progressive white voters in order to win the city. So, I think both candidates have a good shot at getting it. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks.
I want to ask you a little bit about the city council race, starting with the at-large results. There were a number of candidates who did more on social media and certainly spent more money, and they're not going to be in the final. But and some of the people in the final include Althea Garrison. But on the other hand, what about Ruth C. Louis-Jurin? This is her first campaign. She did great.
Yeah, she raised, I think, more than $250,000, which is phenomenal for a first-time candidate. She's, from Mattapan, grew up here. I think going to Harvard Law School in Columbia means you have classmates who can write you $1,000 checks. That's very helpful. Having worked on Elizabeth Warren's campaign as a general counsel, she had a lot of built-in advantages, and I think she presented well. She was able to campaign full-time and touch a lot of voters. I certainly saw her on the campaign trail. She worked really hard.
What about the things that make for successful campaigns? Because I saw a lot of union endorsements for Kim Janey, especially, and the numbers gave me pause because is this just about the candidates, or is there something about the troops out there, the way they can add up to a winning margin? Has that maybe changed in some way?
I mean, I do think that this time around, I think the election, was somewhat of a hard sell with the lower turnout. So the ground game was pivotal, and it was really crucial. I think we saw that a little bit more in the district races, to some extent, that the candidates who were able to themselves be on the doors. So, Ivandro Cavallo and Brian Worrell in District 4, which is Dorchester, and in Roxbury, District 7, Tanya Anderson was also, touched as many doors as she could. She I'm sure she was, well over 2,000 doors, which is really what you need to win in one of those races is to have a great ground game. So in general, the ground game prevailed this time around.
We should mention District 6. If I'm not mistaken, Yawu, I think this is the first time we've had a finalist in District 6, JP in West Roxbury, is a person of color.
This is the first time we've had a finalist in District 6, and for an open seat, who actually came from Jamaica Plain and not from West Roxbury. West Roxbury has dominated this seat since it was drawn in 1983, I believe, or the first election in 1983. So but also for a Black woman to win in that seat.
You should mention her name, Kendra Hicks.
Kendra Hicks, yes, she's Dominican and Afro-Latina, and she worked really hard against Mary Tamer, was the candidate, I think, who came in second. And Mary Tamer is from West Roxbury, has deep roots there, former school committee member. She's of Lebanese and Syrian descent, so she has she appeals to those communities in West Roxbury who are statistically significant. She has a lot of advantages. I think that two things that Kendra Hicks was campaigning earlier. She started in the fall of last year. So she had more time to hit more doors. She worked really hard. She had a good army behind her. And another factor is that Jamaica Plain has been increasingly flexing its electoral muscle, largely due to the efforts of groups like JP Progressives, so in 2018, in that primary, Ward 19 had the highest voter turnout percentage of any ward in the city. It was 40%. West Roxbury was 36%. So, we're seeing an increased participation among white progressives in Boston, which is, relatively new in Boston, that white progressives have become a dominant force.
I want to ask you about the electoral chemistry, because if you look at the two finalists for mayor, I know people like to pigeonhole them. One's more progressive, the other one's more moderate or conservative. But if you look at their path to where they are right now, engaging with different kinds of people, even outside their pigeonholes, what do you see?
I think that obviously Wu has captivated the imagination of the progressive voters in Boston. I think in her campaign speech last night, Anissa was talking about how she actually gets things done. And I think that part of what gave Wu a hard time with Black voters, with progressive organizations like the Chinese Progressive Association, Mi Gente. I think part of it was that her rhetoric this time around is very progressive, but her record is not. She was anti-rent control until 2019. During 2019, she was against rent control. She backed Bill Linehan against Ayanna Pressley for city council president, and she campaigned in Chinatown against Suzanne Lee, who is somebody who's from Chinatown, who's been involved in politics in Chinatown since the early 70s, and came within a few percentage points of beating Bill Linehan, and she was on the other side of that. So she has a record that doesn't square with her current positions, and I think that Anissa was kind of picking away at that, saying that it's one thing to have the rhetoric, but it's another thing to actually get things done. That said, Anissa is not, does not have a strong progressive platform, and does not have, the progressive positions on issues like policing and other issues. So, it's going to be very interesting. I think this race from here on, issues are going to play a very major role, because, Black voters might feel like they don't have a horse in the race. So what are your stances on police reform? What's your stance on rent control? So I do think that if people get a sense that Michelle Wu can be trusted to follow through on these positions, that they're not just positions she's adopted for this electoral cycle, she might have an edge.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Good to be here. Thanks, Chris.
That was Yawu Miller, the senior editor for the Bay State Banner.